Recording. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Alan Bowser. I'm president of the Montgomery County Civic Federation. And this evening, we are hosting the Montgomery County Planning staff to discuss their draft of a proposed general plan called Thrive 2050. Among our special guests are Khalid Asal, Carrie McCarthy, Gwen Wright, who is the director of the planning department, and the Honorable Casey Anderson, who's the chairman of the Montgomery County Place Planning Board, all good friends. And I see we've got representatives from neighborhoods as well as representatives from the Civic Fed, and everybody is welcome. Let's let the planning staff and officials do their presentation before we engage them in conversation. I understand there may have been a similar program last night presented to the Silver Spring Citizens Advisory Board. So they are very well-versed in what they'd like to communicate to the community. And I know that we have dozens of questions we'd like to ask about the draft as well as the process. So without further ado, Khalid, let me turn it over to you, and please take it away.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks everybody for the opportunity to talk about Thrive Montgomery. Do you want us to talk about, introduce ourselves, or should I go ahead and bring up the presentation?
Oh, you could introduce yourselves.
Yeah, so again, I'm Khalid Afzal, project manager for Thrive Montgomery 2050 with the director's office in the planning department.
And I'm Gwen Wright. I'm the planning director at Montgomery County Planning.
Casey?
Chair of the planning board.
And I'm Carrie McCarthy, Division Chief for Research and Special Projects and member of the core team for the plan. And I recognize a couple of faces from the presentation we did to the Bethesda Chamber Real Estate Committee a couple of weeks ago. So if you didn't like the presentation Khalid and I gave, you can see if you like the presentation Gwen and Casey give even better.
All right, thank you. And let me share my screen. We have a PowerPoint presentation. Somebody needs to make me.
I will do that. Casey, we can still barely hear you.
Better?
No, it's not.
It's really weird. I've been adjusting the volume. I'll move over here a little bit closer.
Okay, Khalid, you ready?
Okay. Can you see my screen?
If you can all see the first slide, I'm going to kick things off, and Casey and I are going to share the presentation, and then when we get to the Q&A, Casey and I and Khalid and Carrie will all be available to answer questions that you might have. So what we have tonight is Thrive Montgomery 2050, and it is the planning board draft that has been transmitted to the county council. The county council now has it in their hands. They're going to be having a public hearing on June 17th, and then they will have a series of work sessions, and ultimately it is the county council who will take action on this document. But if we could go to the next slide, I want to just remind folks a little bit about what is Thrive Montgomery and why should you care. Our general plan is the overall framework for land use in the county and sort of how we're going to grow. It does not change zoning. It does not get into specifics in terms of new programs and legislation, but it sets our work program and it sets our framework for the next 30 years about how we're going to think about growth in the county. To use as an example, our 1964 plan on wedges and corridors, it was then sort of memorialized in a land use plan in 1969, which you see on the left, but it set broad goals. It did not create a lot of the programs that we have now. It talked about increasing affordable housing. And then a number of years later, that resulted in our MPDU, or moderately priced dwelling unit program. It talked about guiding timely infrastructure, which again, years later ended up in our adequate public facilities ordinance. And it talked about protecting farmland, which again, in 1980, a decade and a half after the original plan, ended up with our ag reserve and our transfer of development rights. So what you need to understand is that this project is at a fairly high level and talks about the goals and the framework for the future, but it will be followed up, we hope, with a variety of projects that will help to make real that framework and those goals for the future. Next, please. So what's the problem and why is it time to update our general plan, Thrive Montgomery? Well, it's interesting to note that most jurisdictions update their general plan every 5 to 10 years. We've done it very, very infrequently. We have our 1964 plan, and then we updated the goals and policies in 1993. But other than that, we really haven't done a full update. So it's been over 50 years. And the reality is that the world has changed and Montgomery County has changed a lot in 50 years. We're dealing with demographic shifts, the problems of climate change, which you talked with DEP about, technological innovations, economic disruptions, lifestyle changes, and add to that the fact that we anticipate about 200,000 new people over the next 30 years or so who will either be coming to Montgomery County or who will be born and decide to live in Montgomery County. So our population estimates, which we, again, based upon our most recent information that we've gotten, seem to be pretty much on target, talk about 200,000 more people in the next 30 years. And next, please. At the same time that we're dealing with this whole changing world and we're having more people come to Montgomery County, we're seeing some trends that are concerning. Our real median household income over approximately 15 years has actually gone down. And that is different than nearby jurisdictions. You can see from this chart that we are actually the only jurisdiction in the red or orange, as it were, in terms of real median household income change. Next, please. We also have noted that business growth has lagged in comparison to our peers in the region and nationally. We have had growth, but at, you can see 5.2%, a much, much lower rate than 20 similar counties. In fact, only about a quarter or so of the rate that other counties have been growing. Next, please. At the same time, we are becoming much more racially and ethnically diverse, which we think is a strength. We think that's a really great thing about the county, but it is a change. And you can see how it compares between 1990 and 2016. Certainly, the number of non-Hispanic whites has decreased, but we've seen a very large number of both Hispanic and Asian residents in the county. So we see that trend continuing, and in another 20 or 30 years, it may be even more diverse with, we're projecting up to 70% of the residents in the county being some race or ethnicity other than non-Hispanic white. Next. All of these changes that we've been mentioning result in some other markers or things that we look at that reflect these trends. One of those is access to educational opportunities. And you can see from this chart the comparison of our PHARMS rate with AP exams with a score of 3 or higher, and the percentage of Black students with an AP exam of 3 or higher. And again, I think it's a pretty interesting chart in that it shows a number of down county and east county schools that have very high PHARMS rates having very low AP exams, and schools with much lower PHARMS rate having much higher AP exams. I think it shows very dramatically that there really are some inequities in our access to educational opportunities, and that is something that we have to try to address for the future of the county. Next image. In terms of climate change, again, I know you just heard a lot from Adam and Patty Bubar, but I want to just reinforce that our area is really experiencing the impact of climate change. In the Northeast, heavy precipitation events have increased by 55% over the last, let's say, about 50 or to 60 years. And that is more than any other part of the United States. Climate change is real, it's here, and we have to be taking action to address it. Next, please. So as we've thought about the economic trends that we're seeing, the diversity trends that we're seeing, the environmental trends that we're seeing, we've really understood that within Thrive Montgomery, within this vision, this framework for the future, we have to focus on 3 overarching objectives: economic health, community equity, and environmental resilience. And those 3 objectives are baked into every chapter of Thrive Montgomery. They don't have their own individual chapters, but they are literally baked into every chapter of the document. And the document lays out a framework for how to address the future growth in the county and the future of the county, to try to make sure that we really achieve these 3 big objectives of economic health, community equity, and environmental resilience. Next slide. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Casey, although I don't see him. I hope he's
I'm here.
able to connect. Are you there, Casey?
Yes, can you hear me any better now? I'm standing next to my screen and microphone.
Yeah, we hear you a little better.
Okay, I'm gonna stand right up against this. I don't think you can see me. It would be a little weird because you just sort of see me right up against the camera here, but since we're looking at the slides, hopefully that won't be too goofy. So the first chapter of the plan addresses compact form and the idea that we should be growing along corridors. And this is essentially a way of rethinking the wedges and corridors plan that you may be familiar with. It's designed to focus growth in a compact footprint and avoid sprawl. That's the simplest way of putting it. Next slide. What you see here is that we're not operating on a blank slate. The grayed in and blackened areas are the parts of the county where land is constrained, either because there's something already built there that is unlikely to get torn down. There is a stream valley or sensitive watershed or wetland that's protected legally from development and probably wouldn't be a good idea to build there even if there were no laws against it. The agricultural zoning, single family zoning in neighborhoods where no other redevelopment is allowed, historic structures, public infrastructure, those sort of things. So what you see is only about 15% of the land, the white areas, are really available for potentially for development or redevelopment. And obviously we don't want to just disperse growth everywhere, because then we would create all kinds of problems, environmental, traffic, and other issues that come with sprawl. So we want to try to find a way to grow in a way that does not spread out, but also can be accommodated within the constraints of what's already built and the things that are already in place. Next slide. We use the word urbanism quite a bit in this plan, and that's not the same thing as urban. I've heard this critique that this plan is about urban places, and that's simply not true. Urbanism is not just about cities any more than socialism is about how many parties you go to or how many friends you have on Facebook. It's a set of ideas about what makes human settlements work. And by that, I mean everything from a big city to a rural crossroads. So what you see there on the right is an image of urbanism in action. That is a small rural village. You have a general store, perhaps a bar or restaurant, maybe a church across the street. That combination of things all in one place is, at a very small scale, the same set of things that makes a bigger city or a town center or even a suburban place work and provide the set of services, amenities that people need to live their lives. Next slide. You may have seen the wedges and corridors map, which shows where growth is supposed to be considered appropriate, where it's considered inappropriate. It's very similar to this map that we're proposing in this plan. What you see here is a slight modification of the wedges and corridors plan as it was refined in 1993. Most of the growth per the 1964 plan and subsequent refinements was supposed to be in what was called the urban ring. That's the area closest to Washington, D.C., roughly south of Randolph Road. Some people would call that the down county, but not just inside the Beltway. And then growth was supposed to proceed in corridor cities running out what's now the I-270 corridor. The original 1964 plan included a corridor on I-95 and Route 29 in that part of the East County. That was written out of the plan in 1993. And one of the most significant things that we propose in this plan is to put it back. In reality, what's happened, that is to say in the real world, not just what's in plans, there has been growth along the I-95 and Route 29 corridor. And we've already planned to accommodate more in White Oak around the FDA and Adventist Hospital. Similarly, the eastern leg of the Red Line was not an idea that had come to fruition in 1964. And so nobody really thought of Georgia Avenue as being a growth corridor. But obviously today we have a red line running from Tacoma Park through Silver Spring, Forest Glen, Wheaton, where I'm right now, all the way to Glenmont. And so we're showing a corridor that goes to Olney because that reflects the reality of where growth has occurred. However, I think you can see from this map, we're maintaining the integrity of the compact footprint that was planned in 1964 and reiterated in 1993. The idea is to focus any new development or redevelopment in compact communities located on corridors, the first choice being within that growth footprint and on those corridors that you see on this map, and to a limited degree outside that growth footprint where there are existing centers of activity, existing communities that need to be allowed to fill in, be supported organically, and evolve. And I'm thinking when I say that of places like Damascus, or places like Poolsville, or places like Ashton and Sandy Spring, which are never going to be and should not be downtown Bethesda or Washington, D.C. or downtown Silver Spring, but should still be allowed to evolve. And this plan recognizes that those communities exist and that they're appropriate and that they need to be supported. But the primary focus of growth should be within the growth footprint. And even to the extent that places like Poolsville grow, we should not be expanding their boundaries or allowing them to spread out. Next slide. So this reviews some of these recommendations. I won't read the slide because it covers some of the things that we just discussed, but if you want to look at it later, it might help refresh your memory. Next slide. The second chapter addresses the issue of how growth should occur at a somewhat closer to the ground scale. The first chapter was about at the level of the entire county, where should growth be located? The complete communities chapter talks about, okay, in the places where growth is appropriate, what kind of growth and how should that be planned? Next slide. This is a good example of how infill and redevelopment can make communities more complete, which is to say they have a more comprehensive set of services and amenities and infrastructure that serve the needs of the people who live and work there, and also reinforces some of our other goals. We mentioned that environmental sustainability is a major goal of every part of this plan, and I think this slide is a good illustration of how that works. What you see on the left is what used to be the shopping center that we now know as Pike and Rose. And those of you who've lived in the county for more than about 15 years, which I think is most of us, may remember there was a Bye Bye Baby, there was a La Madeleine, I think there was a shoe store, there were, and there was, I think the Silver Diner there on a pad site in the front of the parking lot. So you had a strip of retail in the style of the 1960s, surrounded by, particularly in the front of the property, by an ocean of asphalt and surface parking. And there was no stormwater management because when this was developed, as so many other properties in the county were developed, there was no such thing as stormwater management regulation. What you see on the right is Pike and Rose, which is quite a bit more intense. There's a lot more stuff built there. And yet, even though it has a lot more things and they're a lot taller and they're more intense, there's a lot more development, it's actually much less damaging to the environment because it incorporates stormwater management measures, basically allowing water to infiltrate on the site. There are green roofs, there are trees, there are swales, there's other structural accommodations for stormwater built into these buildings. So water doesn't run off the site in nearly the same volumes. And you see you get a 70-some % reduction in runoff as a result of those stormwater improvements with Pike and Rose. And you can see from the air, it is in fact pretty green, particularly when you compare it to what was there before. So this is part of what we mean when we say that this plan advances environmental sustainability, even as it moves towards achieving some of the other specific goals in the individual components. Next slide. And again, I won't read the slide because there's no need to get into every detail of this. One thing I do want to highlight, though, that runs throughout this plan, which is not one of the major overarching goals about economic competitiveness, equity, and environmental sustainability, but I think are important and also run through each chapter. There are two of them. The first is that everything we build should be designed to encourage more physically active lifestyles. We need to get people off the couch. That's important both for public health reasons, and it's also important to the welfare of individuals to be encouraged to get up and move around as much as possible. That doesn't mean everybody needs to be an athlete, but it means that communities that are designed to facilitate and encourage at least a limited amount of walking are good for everybody, at least to give people the opportunity to walk and make that more appealing. That doesn't just mean vision zero, making sure people don't get hit by cars, that's part of it, but it's also about building the kind of places where people want to walk around and they have things to walk to that are interesting and attractive to them. The second thing that runs throughout this plan, even though it's not featured in one of those major three themes, is the idea of social interaction. Everything that we build, whether it's public infrastructure like a library or a park, or even a shopping center, can encourage or discourage people from interacting with each other. And that, I think, is an important thing in the age of Trumpism and the polarization and the hostility that that seems to characterize so much of our public life. The built environment, the things that get built by the government or things that get developed by private landowners aren't going to solve those problems, but they can make a contribution towards bringing people together and encouraging them to interact with each other in public spaces and in private spaces as well. So I think that's one of the interesting things about this plan that you won't see in every other land use plan. You certainly didn't see it in 1964. Next slide. Design, arts, and culture. This chapter talks about arts and culture, which is what it sounds like, but the design parts of the plan I think are interesting because they bring the level of detail one level even more into the fine grain, as Gwen likes to say, than the previous two chapters. So remember, compact form on the corridors, that's at the scale of the whole county. Where does the growth go? Compact communities, that's what kind of growth do we want in the places that are supposed to grow? And the design elements of this plan address those details of what happens on a block by block basis, or even in individual buildings. What's the architecture like? How are buildings oriented with each other? And that's important, not only because it creates aesthetically appealing places, hopefully, but also, as I said, those are the kind of details that can encourage people to get up and walk around if they have places that are attractive to walk in and through. It's the kind of thing that encourages people to interact with each other if they're encouraged to move through spaces and meet other people, or at least as passersby, as they go about their business. Next slide. I want to talk about specifically how that plays out in practice. One of the ideas in this plan is that we should move away from concepts like quote unquote compatibility and towards more objective standards to determine what is permissible to build. Now, I've heard some pushback on this, that this plan throws away the idea of compatibility. That's not true. We're not suggesting that compatibility is not important. What we're suggesting is that a concept as vague as compatibility is pretty useless in terms of, it's not very helpful if you're a property owner. You want to know what you can build, because who knows what that means until you get to the planning board. It's not very useful if you're somebody who lives nearby a project that's going to be built, because similarly, you don't know what's really going to be allowed until it goes through a process where the planning board or the county council or hearing examiner will apply that concept pretty subjectively. So one of the things that we're trying to do is not throw out compatibility, but give it some more specificity so it means something. So we can all know ahead of time what should be allowed and what shouldn't be allowed. And that hopefully will serve to create better places, more attractive places, places that are more functionally successful, and the kind of places where people want to be. And that means including more elements in the zoning code that address the specifics of how buildings should be designed in terms of their architecture, perhaps building materials, how close should they be to the street, what should be in the right-of-way next to the roadway, how wide should the street widths be, what kind of sidewalks should be there, there be a landscape panel, should there be street trees, should there be bicycling infrastructure. All these things are specific details that can give everybody an predictability and assurance that what gets built will be of high quality and will be the sort of place where people want to live and work. Next slide. And the last point I want to make about compatibility is that it's important to have objective standards if we're going to have to accommodate different building types. I think it's inevitable that with a county that is a mature development pattern, as you saw, there's not a lot of unconstrained land available. A lot of our future growth will be infill, and it will be somewhat more intensive than what's there before. Like you saw with Pike and Rose, is much more than was there when it was a 1960s style strip shopping center. So if we're going to do that successfully and equitably, it's important that concepts like compatibility cannot be a tool for people to say, well, I don't think that's compatible, when what they're really saying is, I don't want people like that living anywhere near me. So that's why I think that this concept of more objective standards is important for equity, not just for the predictability of the real estate development regulatory process. Next slide. And now I'll turn it back over to Gwen to talk about the last three chapters.
So one of the things that is really important and that ties together all of these complete communities that Casey was talking about is our transportation and communication networks. We need safe and efficient transportation to support our land use goals. We need to reduce our total dependence upon automobile travel. You know, if we were able to reduce vehicle miles traveled significantly and make new buildings energy efficient, those two things in and of themselves would be the key ways to reduce more than half of our greenhouse gas emissions. We need to focus on transit, walking, bicycling, and rolling. And we need to improve transit, not only for safety reasons, for community building reasons, but really for better job growth. And we need to provide access to jobs, education, and other opportunities for low-income communities. Next. One of the things that is really key is that we are not an island in Montgomery County. We are part of a region, and we need to think about how we connect to some of those regional destinations, not only the District of Columbia, which has been historically the hub that we all work around, but we now have some amazing places like the University of Maryland at College Park, which is really a nationally known research center. We have Fort Detrick. We have all of the developments happening at Tyson's Corner. We have the developments happening near Dulles. We need to think about how we connect with these other very important communities, both from a transportation perspective, but really also how we think about other issues such as housing and other topics in a regional perspective, rather than just closing the gates and saying we're just an island. Next. Well, the only other thing I would say about that before jumping into housing is, again, the vehicle miles traveled. What we see is that in our down county areas, our minutes of commute per day are much, much shorter. And that is so important, not only in terms of reducing vehicle miles traveled, but giving people lifestyle opportunities to do things outside of their vehicles. And some of the active lifestyles that Casey talked about, some of the community connectedness that he also talked about. All of those are related to how we create transportation systems that allow us to spend less time in our cars. Another big issue is affordable and attainable housing. And what we really have said in regard to housing is we need more of everything. We need deeply affordable housing that may be subsidized. We need MPDUs. We need what has been called sort of market rate housing that is affordable, the 80 to 100% AMI. And we need regular market rate housing. We need more of everything. Next. One of the reasons we need more of everything is demonstrated by this chart. We have really taken a dip in the housing that we produced since 2008, and we've never really fully recovered from the total number of building permits per year since the Great Recession. We're certainly much lower than where we were in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And we know that in order to meet the needs that we've identified, the 200,000 new people, we need to do more than just achieve our forecasted housing growth. We need to go above and beyond that and get back to some of the rates that were more typical in the early 2000s. And if we are not able to produce that housing, it is going to be very, very difficult to have affordable or attainable housing for all of our children, grandchildren, people who want to live in the county. It's a supply and demand issue. If we are not producing enough housing and the people still are arriving in the county, the cost of housing is just going to continue to go up and up and up. And that certainly benefits people who own their houses now and who are able to sell their houses at a great profit. But it does not benefit, our children and our grandchildren who are not able to get a foothold into the real estate world and may never be able to have the same abilities to own property that our generation has had. Next, please. One of the things that we're seeing, and this is partly because of our partly because of our aging population, but also just partly because of our general demographic shifts to having much smaller households. Our households are really getting smaller, as you can see with the chart on the left, but the actual physical houses are getting bigger. So we have fewer people living in bigger spaces. And that is, that's challenging because it doesn't provide a lot of opportunities for those small entry-level kinds of condos or very small townhouses that many of us probably, those were our first kinds of real estate that we bought before we moved into, a single family detached house with a yard. We don't have a lot of those options available for the next generation. Next. And we also don't have, again, a lot of land, which we've made this point several times. When you look at this chart, more than a third of the county is zoned for single family houses. Less than 3%, which is the brown box, is for multifamily. And we have at least, as you can see from the two green boxes, well over a third of the county in sort of permanent agriculture, parks, and open space. So if we're going to think about new places to put housing, we have to start thinking outside the box, no pun intended. And we have to start thinking about how can we co-locate housing? How can we put housing in places which will be compatible, but maybe aren't exactly the way we've done it in the past? So it's definitely a challenge, and it's something that we're very focused on right now. Next. So what we're trying to really say as major goals and themes to the housing chapter is that our housing production needs to align with our housing needs. What we really don't need is lots of additional big single family houses because households are getting smaller. What we do need is a variety of housing types, so especially near transit, so that we can actually give people different options, whether they're just entering the housing market or whether they're downsizing and thinking about changing their lifestyle as they're getting older. We need to reduce costs through innovative construction. We need to allow diverse housing types, including the duplexes, triplexes, multi-family units in many different neighborhoods where they haven't traditionally been, including some of our single family neighborhoods near transit. You all know that we're working on a Silver Spring and adjacent communities plan. You also know that we're working on our Attainable housing strategies effort. And so we're sort of trying to chew gum and run at the same time. We're talking about some of these goals in Thrive Montgomery, but we're trying to also think about ways to address some of the immediate needs that have been identified. Next. The final chapter has to do with parks and recreation. And, you know, we have had a wonderful park system for many, many, many years, but we're trying to make it even better. We're trying to create a park system that provides access to parks for everyone who lives in neighborhoods so that you don't have to drive to a large regional park. You can actually walk or bike to a park nearby. You can get physical activity easily. It's not only convenient, it's sort of irresistible is a word that we've been using to get outside, to get into a park, to really enjoy the natural world. We've all seen that as so important during the pandemic. And we want to, some themes are promoting those active lifestyles, having park and recreation opportunities that are accessible by walking, biking, and rolling, not just by having to get in your car and drive to a large regional park, but being able to really have opportunities to get there easily and to have equitable distribution of parks and recreation facilities, having more smaller walkable facilities, having them in every community in the county. Next. So we have a few conclusionary remarks. Really, you know, we've said before that we aren't changing any zoning through Thrive Montgomery. We are laying a framework and laying a vision for the future. We know that to accomplish that vision, we're going to have to partner with public agencies and with private development. We're going to have to look at all of the tools in the toolkit: master and sector plans, functional plans, park plans, the zoning code, the subdivision regulations, APFO, other kinds of guidelines. We're going to have a concerted effort over the next 10, 20, 30 years to try to work with our partners, think differently, and move the county into its next phase of maturity. Casey, did you want to add to that?
Well, I think that there is some misunderstanding that I've heard from a lot of folks about the function of a general plan. I hear some people say, well, what will it cost, for example? And the important thing to remember is that this plan guides future development of things like capital budgets. The 1964 plan certainly did not include a cost estimate, and yet it's been one of the most useful and enduring land use planning documents in the entire country, and certainly very useful and relevant in Montgomery County. So I think that it's important to understand what this document does and what it doesn't do. And it really, as Gwen said at the beginning, sets the agenda and frames issues for further refinement and implementation over the next couple of decades. And with that, maybe we should take questions.
Questions are welcome at this time. People should try to indicate their interest in asking a question by using the raise hand function. You click on the participants button at the bottom of your screen, and then there is a raise hand. It should be a raised hand, right? A raised hand indication. Or you can wave and then we'll call on you. Let me say that the issue of housing is the subject which has consumed many of our conversations about the general plan and the proposed zoning text amendments that we have seen. The essence of the foundation of the Civic Fed is single family housing, neighborhood civic organizations, homeowners associations. So the nature of the plans that have come from the county council and from the planning staff are really concerning. We have been the subject a lot of really nasty incoming from people who have tried to portray the civic associations and single-family neighborhoods as being opponents to progress. So we're really interested in sort of the granular detail that we hope that the staff is working on with their community, the HEAT community group. And our interest is that there's a lot more community engagement on this subject. Now, I know that Gwen has said this in one of our earlier meetings, that she's very proud of the outreach that the planning board staff has done to communities. We don't think it's enough. Just last night, the Civic Federation passed a resolution complaining about the speed of this process and the lack of community engagement, recommending that we slow down this process so we can really talk about some of the broader issues that are involved with the housing plan and the general plan. I've got a bunch of questions, but I just wanted to introduce sort of our concerns at the outset. And the next question I will ask Karen Cordry to make. And you're muted, Karen.
Yes, okay. And I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but yes, I think I would agree with Alan. This is a question that has been on everyone's mind. I'm on this task force to talk about the housing and so forth. And I think we, there's been a lot of concerns expressed about some of these things, and Carrie's put some of it in the chat as well. There's a lot of very granular issues on this, and I take this very seriously because I'm in Kensington Heights, which.
You just muted, Karen.
Sorry. We're just on the other side of the Wheaton Mall from the Park and Planning Building. We are ground zero for any of these kind of proposals. Right now, we have a very mixed community. We have a lot of townhouses. We have a lot of single family houses, very small houses, very big houses, everything in between. I think there's a real concern as to how, when you put these things in, which I don't think most people have a disagreement that it would be, if you were starting from scratch, let's put it this way, I don't think most people would have any problem with the notion of the duplexes or the triplexes or these kind of ideas. As I say, we have lots of townhouse communities in our area. I think the question is, what happens with the homes that are here? Are we tearing down perfectly good existing homes in order to put them up? A lot of the concerns about the infrastructure issues there, how much more cars, how much more parking. Just to say that you're near transit doesn't necessarily mean that people aren't going to have cars and parking. And I think the other part is that what I was getting ready to write to the planning people was, we're right in the middle of an enormous experiment, which before you'd have had to have a thought experiment, but we've got a real experiment now of what happens when it turns out that three-quarters of the population can do their work at home. When the pandemic gets over, is everything going to go back to normal, or is there going to be a huge difference in where people work, when they work, how they commute, what their transit uses are, and things like that? So I think one of my questions here, let me just sort of end it up this way. One, how are you doing with these sort of infrastructure issues? And two, what is the role that is being thought of right now in terms of what it kind of effects you're seeing from the pandemic and how that's affecting what you would have been thinking about a year and a half ago when you started this process? So,
Well, let's start with the second one first. I think I'll give Gwen the hard one. I'll take the easy one. That's my prerogative, right, Gwen?
Right.
So as far as the pandemic is concerned, I actually do think that's the easy question, because I think it's human nature to overreact to whatever's right in front of you. And I think the history of land use planning, certainly in the 20th century, is littered with examples of attempting to try to figure out how some new development, principally in the 20th century, that was the automobile. And lately, people have been talking about what does self-driving cars mean, right before the pandemic, and really overreacting that and forgetting that over the centuries, and even success or consistent. That's not to say that the pandemic won't change to some degree where people decide to live and work, or that self-driving cars won't change to some degree the way people get around. But this plan is predicated on the idea that there are certain things that are enduring. Why do people come together to live close to each other? I submit to you, the reason is for exchange, economic exchange, so they can trade with each other, so they can undertake economically productive activity and make their living, social exchange, so they can interact and have the companionship of other human beings, and intellectual exchange, so they can work together and trade ideas. And I think the best illustration of that is the fact that Amazon did not select as its second headquarters a location in the middle of rural Mississippi, even though that would have been a lot cheaper. Instead, they decided to locate in one of the most congested, expensive metropolitan areas in the entire country, which is much like one of the most congested, expensive metropolitan areas where their first headquarters was. Why would they do that? They're not stupid. They did that because they know that the benefits of bringing people together physically close together so they can work with each other and collaborate and exchange ideas generates innovation and economic value. So I'm not pretending that the pandemic will change nothing, but what I am saying is the things that make communities successful over time, which is the opportunity to interact with each other and engage in social, economic, and intellectual exchange, are going to be the same over time, and that there will be more in common with what's worked over the centuries and millennia than there is different in the future. And we have to obviously adapt to something, not just the pandemic, but remember when 9/11 happened, a lot of people predicted that Washington, D.C. would be profoundly affected, that international travel would be devastated for the long term. And really, things are pretty much as they were before, but we have a lot of bollards around NIH, and we have to go through an X-ray machine every time we get on an airplane. But other than that, we've pretty much returned to something very much like what was the way that we lived before 9/11. And honestly, I think that we're going to find 2 or 3 years from now, we're going to be back. It won't be exactly the same it was before, but this is a plan for 30 years. It's not a plan for reacting to the next 6 months or the last year and a half.
And I would just add to that Montgomery County has some very unique economic focus areas, and they're healthcare and biotech. And in both of those, you really can't do those from home. You really can't be a nurse from home. You cannot be a biotech researcher with a laboratory from home. And so even if some jobs end up being more telework than they were in the past, many of the jobs in this county don't, frankly, lend themselves to telework. And so I think that, yes, there may be changes, as Casey was saying, but it's not going to be like everyone is suddenly going to stay home. We're going to still have people who will work, who will gather. We're still seeing new office buildings that are being built, being filled with companies. And so again, it's going to be a change, but maybe not as dramatic as I think folks have focused on. You know, your other question really is about sort of housing and how are people going to live. And, you know, we understand that there is a lot of concern about change in our communities. But I would just say that change has been happening, and it will continue to happen no matter what we say, frankly, no matter what we say in Thrive Montgomery or not. Thrive is not so much driving change as it is recognizing the change that is already happening. And, you know, we see it along some of our corridors where we see some townhouse developments coming in. We see it in our areas that are close by our central business districts where we see both higher scale and lower scale multifamily housing. Change is happening. And again, Thrive is not, I would say, not pushing that change. It's recognizing that change and trying to think about how to best manage the change in a way that will retain the highest level of quality of life in the county. That's why we aren't only looking at economic health, we're looking at community equity, we're looking at environmental sustainability. Those are all equally important.
Let's ask Nancy, do you have a question? Nancy? You're muted. Nancy, we can't hear you.
Yeah, I think there were other people before me. Do they mind if I go?
I'm
Is that all right?
picking people, and you can go.
Okay. I have read the plan, but I've also read plans by our neighboring jurisdictions that have the same tenets, the same objectives, the same themes, but there the paths divide. Thrive 2050 keeps at a generalities level. It keeps on using all of these ideological, trendy things, and it has a slant really skewed towards anti-racism. And I really don't think racism is what our communities are about. But my point is, when you look at the other plans, and I've examined the DC plan, I've examined the Arlington County plan, they did engagement with communities as part of their preparation, and their preparation was far more in depth. The way their plans are structured, they go section by section of the city, they examine each city's neighborhoods, their assets, their deficits, the main commercial and transportation corridors that go through their sectors, and they work through each section of the city and the city as a whole, or the jurisdiction as a whole. They talk about different economic drivers like the industrial zones. They analyze in more depth into how to develop jobs to support the housing, but they also culminate in action plans where I'm sorry, I have to plug in my battery is running low. They chart everything out with a timeline, with, they're no more setting policy or writing policy than you are, or changing zoning laws, but they're correlating what
What's going on?
and seem like one big textbook introduction without missing the rest of itself. So I'd like to know how you arrived at what you arrived at, and why did you not do any community out, these first as a finished product?
So let me address the outreach first. We've had over 170
I went to one of the very first ones, and it was after the plan was complete, after the brochure was printed, after the slides were done.
For 2 years, we've been doing community meetings before we ever put any pen to paper. And we've continued to do community meetings as we started putting pen to paper. The other thing that I do want to say is that we are different than our neighboring jurisdictions. The District of Columbia does go neighborhood by neighborhood, but they actually rezone certain areas through their comprehensive plan. We do not rezone any of our communities through our general plan. If you read the 1964 plan and if you read the 1993 update to the policies and objectives, they are at a similar level of generality as the document that we've put together for Thrive. I would say that we actually have taken an additional step to lay out some future actions with timelines, and those are in a appendix that is a separate document from the main body of Thrive. And we didn't want to put the actions in Thrive because we really do not update our general plan as frequently as other places. Other places update their general or comprehensive plan, some every 5 years, some every 10 years, and they make specific zoning decisions as part of that. Our general plan and traditionally has been updated very infrequently. Again, we've done it twice in 50 years, and it is at a higher level that lays out a framework and does not actually create a new zone or a new program or a new legislation. But it can lead to those over time. And each of those efforts to do a new plan, a new program, a new piece of legislation has its own separate outreach and community discussion. So again, I use the example
However,
of TDRs. If you've looked at the 1964 plan, there is nothing in that plan that says you shall create a plan for preservation of rural and agricultural open space, and you shall have transfer of development rights.
Gwen, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think what people are really worried about are the single family home aspects of this. And within the DC plan, for example, they are talking about similar changes, but they're also emphasizing that they're trying to preserve the character of the existing neighborhoods as per feedback they got from the communities. And I have to say, I'm very active in various advisory groups around the area, and I had never heard of any outreach connected to the preparation of this.
Well, I'm very surprised. We literally sent out 1,000 letters to every HOA in Montgomery County.
I'm on the HOA, we never got one.
Well, I think we've been to the Civic Fed at least 3 times that I know of.
Well, we knew you were going to say that, but I have to agree with Nancy. I've been doing this kind of engagement since 2005, if not earlier, and I don't remember getting any kind of indication of outreach from the planning department on a general plan. And
Alan, how many times have we been to the Civic Federation on this particular project?
I'm talking about before the Civic Fed, coming to the neighborhood, coming to Park Hills, coming to my East Silver Spring community. Now, since I've been involved in this, I've made it my a priority to engage the planning staff with meetings like this so we can have the conversation. But, I didn't see the farmers markets. I don't remember the postcards. I didn't go to any public in-person meetings with this. So I feel like Nancy.
We'll share those with you. We did all of that.
Well, I'm just saying,
at the farmers market.
We
sent 1,000 postcards
I've mentioned this before.
all.
I mean, back in last time when we had the beginning of this conversation, that I didn't remember the outreach. So we have a difference of opinion about that, and I'm glad we're having the meeting tonight.
Please answer me.
Yeah, this is the first brochure that
the Civic Federation on this project.
I think that Harriet told me tonight it's been 4 times.
Yeah, 4 times to the Civic Federation.
Yeah, but since
has any community group from this group ever requested a separate meeting that we have turned down?
I'm sure you did not. I'm sure you did not. I'm just saying that it's been since I've been involved in this. That's when I focused on engaging the planning board staff because it's so important to the Civic Federation. Well, we're going to disagree about that. I'm going to move on to Mario. He's got a question.
I understand this is a draft. Hi, my name is Mario. I'm an aspiring planning student, so I'm enjoying the meeting a lot. But I was a little bit surprised as far as the lack of mention of accessibility throughout the presentation. And that is to people that uses wheelchairs and that kind of language in the planning at all. It's a little bit surprising and concerns me. I understand this is just a draft, but is there a reason why there isn't much talk or mention of accessibility? Because this is just a draft, as I understand it, but I think it should be included as we strive to have access, equity, right?
Well, I think that again, the plan is written at a level of generality that doesn't necessarily address every specific aspect of implementation. But I think that much of the foundation for making our communities more accessible is about making that more suitable for walking, biking, and you'll notice the word rolling in there, which encompasses not just people in wheelchairs, but people on scooters, on skateboards, other conveyances, bicycles, all those sort of things. And the same things that about the granular design of places and sites and streets that support walkability for people who have a full range of physical abilities are in fact the same things that make those places more accessible to people who have more limits on their physical capability of their mobility. So that's one example. The other thing is, I think that as we create missing middle housing, we have more of an opportunity to create more housing types which are more suitable for people with a variety of needs. I'm not just talking about design for life, although that's a very specific example of that, but creating more housing types other than single family houses can support people not just of different income levels, but different lifestyle needs. Some of those lifestyle needs are driven by preferences, just what your tastes are. Other lifestyle needs are driven by your physical needs. So I think that there's a lot in the plan that supports a more accessible and built environment for everyone. And even though it doesn't spend much time talking specifically about the needs of people with specific physical disabilities and their ability to get around, I think that there's a lot in this plan that is very consistent with an interest in making our communities more accessible.
Thank you, Mario.
I do.
Go ahead, Mario.
Yes, I do think there's an important difference between being explicit about it. I think it's, if we're discussing inclusivity, I think it will be valuable for people to know that they're being accounted or considered in this plan. Thank you.
Yes, that's a good point. I think we can certainly accommodate that.
Thank you, Mario. Luella?
I live in the Colesville area in East County. I will do a great economic difference in the have-nots. I'm wondering, one of the charts I did not see, and I didn't expect to see here, of course, is a map of the median income in the various parts of the county and how the new types of housing you are proposing will end up making the east part of the county more of a have and the west part of the county more of a have-not. I anticipate that will be very difficult to do. In fact, I anticipate it will be impossible. And I think that is what concerns me the most as I listen to a general plan that talks about equity. And that's it. Thank you.
Well, I think this plan very directly addresses that concern, and most specifically, as I mentioned, by putting the Route 29 corridor literally back on the map. which was a decision which was made in 1993 to write it out of the plan. And we don't need to go into the history of that, but the effect of that was to say, no, thank you to new public investment, no, thank you to new private investment. And in my judgment, that was a major error in judgment. I know that the people who did that thought they had the best interest of the community in mind, but I put it to you that the legacy of that decision in many ways has been to leave many parts of the East County behind, whereas investment was attracted, both public and private investment, to the west side of the county. I also would say that the housing chapter of this plan is very consistent with what you just said, which is the idea that we want more housing types of all types, market rate housing and affordable housing, more affordable housing in the west side of the county, more market rate housing in the east side of the county. So if that's your concern, you should be a big advocate for this plan, because it very explicitly advocates the idea that affordable housing belongs everywhere and market rate housing belongs everywhere, that it should not be allocated to one side of the county or the other. And that's important, not just for equity between regions of the county, it's also important to address some of the problems you get when the more affordable housing is one side of the county, many of the jobs are on the other side of the county, and everybody's trying to drive back and forth to get from a place that they can afford to live to the place where they work. So there's many reasons in terms of transportation, the environment, et cetera, as well as equity between different parts of the county and different people who live or can afford to live in different regions.
And again, this plan sets a framework. It is not the answer to all questions. But we are following up, for example, in our work program, and one of the plans that we're going to be starting that we think is a direct outgrowth of some of the themes in Thrive Montgomery is a Fairland-Briggs-Cheney plan, and a plan that can focus on very tightly on the corridor where the new BRT is running and where we have a lot of our most significant equity opportunity areas in the county, to talk about how we can improve those areas, not just with housing, but with other kinds of commercial and retail development, and how we can make use of the infrastructure that's already been put in place. So as I said before, we're trying to sort of run and chew gum at the same time, and we're trying to take the next step, which is take this big 30,000 foot framework and begin to look at how it actually affects specific corridors. Particularly the one we're looking at next will be Fairland-Briggs-Cheney, but again, narrowly focused on that corridor.
Thank you, Gwen. Carrie Lamari.
Hello, Casey, Khalid, Gwen. It's good to see all of you.
Hi.
And I appreciate you coming down here to talk to us. Now, I posted a great many statements because I couldn't focus questions. I was too busy trying to type in the chat. I would like to have Khalid respond to them so that I can share them with the communities that I communicate with. But what I want to say tonight is this. You know, it's always interesting to take a picture, or in this case, a general plan, and then rely on data that is focused on today, the middle of a pandemic, 2% economic loss. And it's not just the pandemic. I mean, it's the times that we're living in, the disparity that exists between different parts of the county, educationally, as well as our livability, and then take a look at the action, the response to these dynamics. I mean, when I looked at the farm rates, the educational achievement from the east part of the county and compared it to the western side of the county, you could see that we have a lot more challenges here on the east side of the county than the west. Then I look at this compact communities design. How do we respond to these challenges, right? We respond by doubling the density all along our transportation corridors in the east. I don't know if that's the wisest thing we should be doing. Secondly, when you want to consider the environment, we had a presentation last night where I forgot the gentleman's name. Alan can help you with me later, the head person from DEP. He indicated that the staff at Park and Planning apparently wasn't working as well as it could be. I'm not slamming anyone, but with Department of Environmental Protection, and many of their concerns were not even considered or implemented within Thrive Montgomery.
Well,
I have a problem with it. Let me finish talking. Let me finish
I-
talking here.
I-
Let me finish talking here. I got the mic and I've waited for this. And I don't want to lose my train of thought here while I can.
Yeah.
Also, back
Well-
in the 40s and 50s,
One of these Civic Federation meetings.
Alan, could you mute that person, whoever it is? Along with the
Okay, go.
growth in the 40s and 50s was rather unhampered here in Montgomery County. That led to significant flooding, and caused, the construction of a 75-acre surface stormwater management pond down Mountcastor Mill Road called Lake Needwood. Later, Lake Frank was needed. The county responded by trying to create all this legislation to protect stormwater management. Here, this plan along these corridors is recommending that we increase, impervious runoff, that we create compact communities with double, maybe more in housing. Today, every time it rains, what we see is flooding in Aspen Hill, along Aspen Hill Road. We see flooding in Sligo Creek. Beach Drive is closed every time we have a major flood. What next? Are we going to have to build another Lake Frank or Lake Needwood on Beach Drive, on Sligo Creek? I don't know where along, the Turkey Branch tributary we can build it. I see the disparities here far overshadowing the benefits. And I have a real problem with that. And then when I speak to the staff in these heat meetings, their responses, and it's on video, it's on YouTube, their responses, I said, this should be comprehensive. The Regional District Act requires any legislation discussion or master plans to be comprehensive, to consider quality of life issues, to consider the environment and all the unintended consequences. Their position is, no, we need to move on. We need to get this thing done. And I'm more interested in what the developers have to say on what it's going to take to make this a reality. Now we're talking about ZTAs. Now on the question of ZTAs, Gwen, all due respect, yeah, you're right. General plans are supposed to be general in nature. They're supposed to ultimately create legislation that responds and helps enact the positive attributes of that general plan. What do we have here? We've got two council members racing before an election to triple the density across Montgomery County with no consideration nor participation of the public. We have a county, in my opinion, that is looking at an existential threat. Without comprehensive consideration, without community participation, without an understanding of the history of Montgomery County, which we don't have because we're not including the public, what are we going to end up with? And I'm sorry. There's a lot of Thrive that I like, but the compact communities, the increased development along corridors without we are not a one-size-fits-all county. As I said, the disparities that exist on the east are not there on the west. We have environmental problems, primarily on the eastern side of the county going towards Rock Creek. Our county is made of rolling hills. It's not flat like Houston, Texas. And take a look at Houston, Texas. They don't have zoning, but they sure had a lot of flooding last year. I got to tell you, we could be doing better. And the way we start is by including the community. Starting now, maybe we need to go back. Because look, I have nothing but respect for Khalid Afzal. He included me right off the bat. We had a meeting, we talked, but his problem was that he had limited access to the public. Those that speak up like me were easily, we were considered, we were given the opportunity, but we did not have a large rollout like we did in the general plan refinement back in what, 1993, 92, I can't remember. We could have done better and we should have done better. Whew, now I want to hear what you guys have to say now.
Yeah, well, I mean, we could be here all night if I tried to unpack everything that you've said, but to the extent that I'll just take one very clear thing that you said, stormwater management. You remember the slide that I showed, showing what Pike and Rose looks like today versus what it looked like 15 years ago. It was a giant slab of asphalt with no stormwater management treatment. So you said, oh my God, how can we be proposing tripling the density on some of these locations? Won't that cause flooding? The answer is you've got it exactly backwards. The only way to get modern stormwater management incorporated into a site like Pike and Rose, or I'm standing here in my Wheaton headquarters building right next to the Wheaton Mall, same thing. That was a mall that was developed in the 1960s and caused major flooding, including into Rock Creek as well as Sligo Creek. And the result of redevelopment and even much more intensive development will be to include modern stormwater management. You saw at Pike and Rose, the result of adding, I don't know what it is, 4 or 5, 10 times as much development on that site is a 77% reduction in stormwater running off the site. So I submit to you, Carrie, not only have we thought about stormwater management and the need to reduce the impact of development and its runoff, that is precisely the reason why we should adopt these recommendations. Because if we develop the county as Thrive contemplates, we will make improvements in stormwater management at no cost to the public. We're spending, I think, on the order of $100 million a year in public money with a stormwater, with water quality protection charge that every taxpayer has to pay. We have to meet the state and EPA's requirements for reduced runoff. If we don't do it through private development incorporating new stormwater management measures, that will come out of every single resident's pocket. So I submit to you, would you rather pay for it yourself, or would you rather use the opportunity for redevelopment of places like Pike and Rose or the Wheaton Mall to achieve those environmental benefits at no cost to the taxpayer?
Casey,
To me, that's an easy answer.
Casey, you're asking me a question, I'm going to answer it, okay?
We have other questions, Carrie, so please make it short.
Well, I have to, very short. Casey, I have to believe that, we will be paying for it. The bottom line is this. I can understand where a mall or a commercial development can be for I do not believe, nor will I ever believe, because I am a contractor, I am a builder, I am an electrical contractor. I've done it all, as far as small development goes. The small developers are not going to do, if you ask them to build, quadruplexes all down George Avenue and into neighborhoods in small apartment buildings, they are not going to give you the green elements, the stormwater management protection that you see at Pike and Rose. So with respect to commercial development, my hat's off to you. Pike and Rose is wonderful. With respect to the residential development that you're going to see on all of our transportation corridors, good.
Carrie, I just have to say you're misinformed on this. The law is all these multifamily projects, apartment buildings, even small apartment buildings, have to meet modern stormwater management requirements, which means environmental site design, managing a 2-year storm and a
Let me interrupt, because I find Casey's argument very compelling, and I don't think that's really the point that we want to make on this issue. Gwen and Casey, please help me with this. As I understand it, we've got a COG requirement to add 30 to 40,000 new housing units by 2030. That's just 8 years away. And it's clear to me that your proposals that have been discussed for missing middle housing, i.e. giving owners right to subdivide their property to double it, triple it, or maybe even quadruple the size, isn't going to scratch the surface of the housing need over the course of the next decade. I know that the county executive is interested in preserving existing affordable housing. Shouldn't the plan emphasize income restricted housing to really accommodate, the thousands of people that the county has agreed to produce housing for over the next 10 years? And is that
the plan recommends that we are not going to solve the housing problem with missing middle. We're not going to solve the housing problem with any. The plan is very clear in saying we need some of everything. We should have co-housing. We should have social housing. We should even probably try some community land trust, which I know is Carrie's favorite housing solution. We should do all of these things. And so the idea that we should not do market rate housing because we need to focus on affordable housing, I think really that's not going to get it done. We need to do all the above. And that's what the plan recommends.
And is there a section in there that talks about?
And one other point I just want to make about this, because we didn't dwell on it in the presentation. There was a slide there that talks about the difference in households. This is a really profoundly important thing I think everybody needs to understand. 36+% of the land area of the county is zoned for single family houses. The percentage of households that consist of 2 adults who are married with school-age children has declined from 60% of households to 25% of households in the space of about 60 or 70 years. Meanwhile, the percentage of households that consist of one person living alone has grown from 7% in 1960 to 25% as of 2019, I think, when the last data was available. That is a profound social change that has profound impacts on the mismatch between the housing that we have zoned for and the housing that would match the way people actually live their lives. It doesn't, so this is a big issue that I think is separate from the question of affordability. It's a question of what kind of housing makes sense when you have a county where 1/4 of the households consist of one person, as opposed to a huge proportion of the and discussion. Do we not have enough housing? We don't have enough the right kind of housing. And we cannot continue with the zoning of the land that we've had in the past that assumes that everybody's going to get married and have kids and live with them until they graduate from high school, because that's not true anymore. It hasn't been true for a long time, and it's probably going to be even less true in the future.
Does the plan? So I read that when I testified before you guys at the public hearing, there was a different text, and I'm wondering whether or not the current draft indicates that income restricted housing is really going to be the way out of this situation to address the huge housing deficit that we have.
Well, as I say, it says we need that, and we also need more market rate housing. We need all kinds of housing.
Okay, Jerry Garson.
All price points.
I'm Jerry Garson. I'm chairman of the Transportation Committee for the Montgomery County Civic Federation. I see that to provide transportation for 200,000 more residents, you're probably in favor of widening the Beltway and widening I-270 and building an additional bridge over the Potomac to provide for the 200,000 new residents that are coming to this county by 2050. We know that 80% of the traffic is not a result of commuting to and from work. And we see WMATA has proposed basically shutting down most of the red line on the western part of Montgomery County. They only want to provide service every half hour, and they want to shut down the trains at Grosvenor, and only south of basically Medical Center would they have service every 15 minutes. We also see that the cost of transportation is going up for cars, but we also see that on the Beltway, right now, we're back to the same traffic patterns that we had before the COVID crisis struck. If we look at last week on the Beltway westbound at just past I-650 New Hampshire Avenue, we see the peak traffic on 3 of the days was between 6 and 7 a.m. It used to be between 5 and 6 a.m., so we were an hour better. And the other 2 days, it's between 9 and 10 a.m. We're getting the rush hour ending somewhat faster. But you need more roads. Where are we going to build the 20% more roads to accommodate the 20% more people if we want them? I'm not even sure that everyone in the county, if we took a vote, would actually vote to increase the county by 20%. We see nationwide the population has literally dropped in the US due to COVID-19 and the lack of births that are occurring. And it sounds very interesting that you seem to be upset that we have a quantity of people, probably a lot of them in my neighborhood, who are single persons who are living in fancy houses, paying taxes and basically not using any government services. All these people who have no children in school, they're great for the county because they provide a large amount of revenue. I don't see anywhere in this whole discussion of a general plan that you want to provide enough revenue to basically attract industry and other people. We have a much higher tax rate than Virginia, and therefore most of the companies want to locate to Virginia. I mean, nowhere are you discussing what the tax policy is and the benefits of having all these basically childless homes in the county that probably provide most of the tax revenue to the county.
Well, again, you've said quite a few things there, so I'll just try to pick a couple of the highlights. Nobody's upset about the fact people live alone in big houses. The problem is when it comes time to sell that big house, if the people who are looking for a place to live want to live by themselves and aren't married with children, I think it stands to reason that a smaller proportion of people are be looking for a 5-bedroom house than are looking for a 1 or 2 bedroom. That's not to say nobody's going to want a house with multiple bedrooms. They might want a home office or a place to have a guest or, you know, have the kids back when you're an empty nester. But the point here is that we have a drastically that people portion of their lives. And that's less true by a lot than it was 50 or 60 years ago. And that is not a value judgment. I mean, there's good things about that, there's bad things about it, but it's a fact. So the point here is not that anybody is doing a good or bad thing by choosing to live the way they live. The point is that we have to provide housing that makes sense for the households as they actually exist in the real world and will exist in the future. You know, as for road construction, you know, it's a little bit like the question about where will all the housing go? We have constraints. We can't add twice the number of lane miles of road over the next 50 or 60 years that we had over the previous 50 or 60 years, because you're going to have to knock down thousands and thousands of houses. There's a lot of stuff that is in the way. So we have to make more efficient use of the existing right-of-way. That necessarily implies not only more reliance on transit, because transit can carry more people in a given amount of space than it can carry cars. It also means that it's important to create communities that are more compact so people don't need to drive 20 minutes to get a jug of milk on Tuesday night at 8 p.m. when they want to make some chocolate chip cookies. They need to be able to have access to things in their neighborhoods that have a more complete set of services so they don't need to drive everywhere. Because you're right, not all the driving, in fact, most of the driving is not driven by driving to work. It's driven by the need to meet all those other daily needs of lives. And we think that the land use ideas in this plan about complete communities are helpful on that score. And I'm sorry I can't address everything that you've said.
I want to ask one question. Ever since the pandemic, we've been using Cabin John Regional Park, which for some unknown reason, you do not permit anyone to walk to. So even though it's less than a mile from my house, and we often take 3, 4, 5 mile walks, I cannot walk safely to Cabin John Regional Park. Wouldn't it be nice to actually provide sidewalks?
We need more walkable access. In an earlier generation, we assumed everybody drive to the park. we shouldn't do that anymore. That's one of the things that I'm glad to hear that there will be at least something about this plenty support, Jerry.
Casey, can you help me with this this question? So what I hear a lot when I have conversations on this issue is that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of units in the pipeline for downtown Silver Spring that haven't been built out. When we revised the zoning code and established the CR zone, I thought the thought was that we would see new development, commercial residential development on the strip malls that dot the county. Why is the development potential been unrealized, given all the work that the planning department, the county council has tried to do?
Well, I think that there's been a shift in the demand for office space, that predates the pandemic. And we've documented this. A study that Carrie and her group did just a couple of years ago about the office market showed that both government employers and private sector employers are shrinking the amount of square feet they want per person, which means that you're going to get less office space per worker than you did in the past. In the short to medium term, at least, the pandemic probably accentuates that trend. Now, that doesn't mean there are no offices, but it means that, previously, you might have assumed that you need 500 or 600 square feet per worker. Maybe you only need 200 or 300 or 400 square feet per worker now. And that shrinks the total office footprint and demand for buildings to house office workers, not just in Montgomery County, but throughout the region. Our office vacancy rates are elevated, but so are the office vacancy rates pretty much in every office submarket in the DC region. In fact, most of the country, because everybody's dealing with the same trend. So I think that has pretty important effects for local government finance, because to the extent there's assumptions that we're going to be able to rely on commercial real estate taxes to subsidize everything else, that is called into question. But that's, again, one of these, in some ways, a social change as much of an economic change with economic implications as it is a decision that is good or bad about planning. We need to make places as attractive as possible to locate the office space that's available in order to attract and retain employers. But I don't think it's realistic to assume that we can magically grow the total demand for offices, because that's a factor that's largely beyond the control of any local government or government, period.
Well, can I just add one thing, which is that I think I want to reinforce what I said earlier, which is Thrive Montgomery is not a new set of ideas. It is actually recognizing the direction that we have been moving as a county probably for the last 10 plus years. So when we created the CR zoning, and we put CR zoning on a number of commercial properties along our corridors, it was a step in the direction that Thrive is headed. We hope that those CR zoned properties that are in the pipeline will build out, and we hope that they're reinforced by other properties along corridors. But Thrive is not a set of new ideas. It is recognizing the direction that the county has been moving for at least the last 10 years. And it is taking that direction and putting it on paper so that it's clearly the framework for the future. The framework from 1993 is no longer pertinent due to all of the things that we have done in terms of creating CR zoning, in terms of looking at redevelopment of strip shopping centers, in terms of the whole parking lots to places idea that we've been promoting. And we are evolving and changing in that direction. What Thrive does is it recognizes that, and it memorializes that, and it says we have changed as a county.
No, I get that. Just Karen, let me just ask this. I don't remember from my prior reading of the last draft, Is the vision for the ag reserve changed? I mean, because most of the conversations I have about that is, there's not a lot of farming in the ag reserve, and sort of leaving that untouched as a, geographic section of the county where development is not taking place. I mean, I'm not in favor of, getting rid of the ag reserve or anything like that, but is there any emphasis in the Thrive plan for encouraging owners to do more agricultural activities than are going now?
Yes, and there was a whole agritourism plan that we did that, again, was a lead up to this document. And there is a whole section on the ag reserve and on the future of the ag reserve, which we are supporting as a place where we should not see additional residential development or commercial development, but keep it as a agricultural and open space, and frankly, recreational area where people can get out into the countryside and make use. I'm looking actually to give you some page numbers. Other folks may want to talk while I'm looking that up, but we definitely addressed the ag reserve quite specifically.
Aaron Cordry, do you have a question?
Yeah, just one thing, I was a little concerned about the notion that this is not looking at anything new. We're just picking up on what's already happening. But the other thing was, a couple of years ago, accessory dwelling units were the big new thing that was supposed to take a lot of this slack up in the county. Has that been a very successful program? And if not, which is what I kind of get the impression, is there something you can see as to why there hasn't been more of that, or what you could do to increase that kind of an approach?
Well, as I think we said at the time, we didn't expect that there would be a lot of accessory dwelling units built. We'd like to see more, but I think nobody ever suggested that there would be a whole lot of them. In fact, that was one of the things we said at the time in response to concerns about how ADUs were going to change the character of every neighborhood. Was we said, look, don't worry, there's just not that many people who are anytime soon going to want to add an accessory dwelling unit. And that's true. That is, for better or for worse, turned out to be true. I think the missing middle discussion is really an extension of that, to provide some more options for different housing types. But I think that nobody should overstate the degree, again, for better or for worse, how much of that is actually going to happen, because most people in a house are perfectly happy living in their house. They're not going to sell to a real estate developer. They're not going to build an ADU. They're not going to tear it down and build a triplex. What we're talking about here is allowing organically over time across the county the evolution of neighborhoods that were planned to include only one thing, and that's single family houses, to allow the gradual incorporation of some different things, which we think are generally consistent with the character of those neighborhoods. But it's too bad that that won't happen more quickly, because we could honestly use the housing units. But the fact is, the alarmism around those ideas is really, I think, unjustified, as the experience with ADUs shows. This is the kind of thing that happens pretty infrequently. Not a whole lot of it happens in any one particular place, and it occurs really over a period of decades, not just not over the space of 1 or 2 years.
So I agree.
Pages 38 and 39 are the ag reserve, if you want to look at those in the Thrive document.
So I agree with you, Casey, that the progress with the ADUs has been slow. It's likely the same thing will happen with the missing middle. Doesn't that suggest that there needs to be a much more focused emphasis on income restricted housing along transportation corridors? I mean, a bigger section of the report, more emphasis. Part of that will take away, some of the, the excitement about the missing middle proposal.
Well, again, I think the issue is you need to do all these things. We can't afford to subsidize. In fact, the county executive, has said we don't need market housing, we need affordable housing. And then he said, oh, but by the way, we can't afford to build more affordable housing, or we can't afford to build much more. And I think that highlights the problem, which is all of these things by themselves have constraints on them. ADUs are not going to solve the problem because not everybody wants to do one. Not everybody's in a position financially to finance the construction of ADU if they wanted to. We're not in a position to buy thousands of acres of land that we could build regulated affordable housing on and rent it out. All these things together have to be done because no one of them by themselves is sufficient to make a dent in the problem. And
I want to just,
yeah.
can I just emphasize page 106 of the document is literally pretty much the only page that really talks about missing middle housing. The very next page, 107, says preservation of naturally occurring and regulated existing affordable units will minimize gentrification and displacement. Building new affordable housing in existing amenity-rich neighborhoods will expand access, and a whole set of additional thoughts. So those ideas are in this document, but unfortunately, everyone is looking at page 106, it seems, and no one's turning the page and reading page 107.
Luella, do you have a question? You guys okay with staying on for a few more minutes?
I can do it till 9:30 and then I need to hop off.
Okay, Casey?
Sure, as long as you want to go.
Okay, Luella, you have a question? You're next.
I should also do the video. I guess I really wanted to thank Alan because I was glad your question about the Ag Reserve came up. I've always been fascinated by the idea that people can go to the Ag Reserve for recreational opportunities and for chances to enjoy the outdoors. When down county, and East County, down county, let's be very specific, are people who don't have automobiles, who don't have transportation, who don't have a way to get this great recreational opportunity and these great outdoor opportunities that are in the Ag Reserve. And I just wish that perhaps that part of that huge Ag Reserve could have been used in the down county areas to provide playing fields and recreational opportunities for families. That's all. Thank you. And thank you, Alan, for that question.
Well, I think that if we had it to do over again, we should probably have taken more land for the Stream Valley parks and perhaps a little less land in the outlying parts of the county. I think that's true, but we're playing the cards that were dealt. I would say that I personally am responsible for getting a whole lot of natural surface trails built in the down county, in the East County, including there's construction underway on trails in the Upper Paint Branch, almost literally as we speak. I mean, it's 9 o'clock at night, so they're not out there right now, but they'll be out there tomorrow morning with the machines and shovels and rakes, building trails for the East County. And we opened up a number of new trails in the Northwest Branch, which I think are some of the best trails in the county. I have my background on Microsoft Teams is the Northwest Branch Trail. A lot of people ask me, oh, is that over there by the Billy Goat Trail on the Potomac? I say, no, I have the good trails over here. And I'm an East County guy through and through. So you can be assured that we're making sure that we're focused on creating better opportunities to get outdoors and outdoor recreation in the East County. But you're absolutely right. We should increase the accessibility of the Ag Reserve. And one of the things the plan says is, yes, we should preserve the Ag Reserve, but we should also make sure it's managed for the benefit of everyone so everybody can get access to it.
So I just want to thank you, Casey, for the good work you've done on trails. I've spent a lot of time outside of Montgomery County parks and on the new trails, and they're always welcome. And your emphasis on cycling and mountain biking is very refreshing. Nancy, do you have a question?
I was just curious, at another community meeting about missing middle housing, Gwen, we asked you if, well, this was more in focus of the ZTAs, and I know that's not what it's about tonight, but I think that's what has everybody deeply concerned, ZTA 2007. And you said that you would be advising the council after considering it. So I understand that that's been tabled lately. So is that as a result of your advisements to them? What happened?
Yes, so that project was moving forward. There were council members who were looking at ZTAs, and I personally reached out to the council members and said, slow down. You're doing this too fast. You are not involving the community. And we got them to delay their ZTAs and put them on hold for about 6 months so that we could have a conversation with the community. And that is including the HEAT group that Carrie Lamari is the designated representative from this organization on. It includes community meetings. They are virtual. It includes office hours. And we're glad to go out and speak to any community group because we're gathering input so that we can give the council some advice about how to proceed in this and not to have them proceed quite as quickly and without looking at the whole issue holistically. We were asked in early March to begin this effort, and we have been working on it diligently since then. We hope to send the council something by the end of June, which they will probably then take up in the fall. So the whole thing was moving at a very rapid pace, and we requested and the council agreed that we needed to slow things down, to do outreach, to do a holistic evaluation, and to offer our advice as the planners.
Great, we really appreciate it because that just seemed too rash to us. And I would like to volunteer a group for you to come out and speak to. I'm with the Maplewood. We're just next to NIH, and we're also affiliated with Locust Hill, and we are both communities within the Metro Medical Center Watershed. And we have some interesting parcels in Maplewood that are owned by associations affiliated with NIH who have put forth various plans over the years for dorms. It's been watered down to things that resemble houses and can be converted and resold as single family houses. And I myself live in an infill community in Maplewood. And I have to say, we are not small townhouses, but in terms of compatibility, fitting with the homes immediately adjacent and the neighborhood as a whole, that was a long, careful process to develop the site plan and make it work out beneficially for everybody. So I really think the council, as well as the planning departments, need to listen to communities directly. So I volunteer our area, please.
We'll be very glad to come out. I think at this point we are doing some in-person site visits, to look around at your community, and if your community wants to have a virtual meeting or a socially distanced in-person meeting, we're glad to do that.
Thank you. We will take you up on that.
Great.
Great. Thank you very, very much.
I'd like to ask Gwen before you jump off and this question. It's sort of a 30,000-foot question. Some of those early slides in the presentation that Khalid was showing indicated a decline in household income in Montgomery County, that our county's employment growth is behind other neighboring jurisdictions, and that we've got a huge achievement gap. We've been talking about these issues for as long as I've been in the county, since 1995, and it's kind of a dismal record. I mean, to what can we attribute sort of the failures of schools and the failures of economic development and the lack of growth in household income to what factors? Because if that's the tableau we're working on, it's going to be hard to get the kind of development and progress that we want to generate more revenues to do all the other things that we need to do.
Well, I think that data is crystal clear. Most of the academic work on the relationship between socioeconomic integration of schools and school performance was based originally on research in Montgomery County. And the reason for that, I'm told, is because the MPDU program in Montgomery County makes it one of the few large school systems that has a significant amount of affordable housing integrated with market rate housing throughout the county. So it gave researchers the ability to collect enough data to be able to make a comparison. And what they found is that racially and socioeconomically integrated schools are more successful schools, particularly for the students who have a lower socioeconomic status, whose parents have lower educational attainment. So I think that there is a relationship, obviously, between housing and schools that has sort of a feedback loop between those two things. But one of the reasons why we think that we need more affordable housing in some of the more affluent parts of the county and more market rate housing in some of the less affluent parts of the county is to achieve a better socioeconomic as well as racial mix in the school system. And I think that there's a lot of research that supports that idea that that's helpful, particularly to students whose parents make less money and didn't go to fancy colleges or didn't go to colleges at all.
Now
And I want to just respond real quickly on the economic side, and I know Carrie McCarthy may have also thoughts on this. We're not trying to paint a picture that Montgomery County is a dismal place and is headed down the tubes. That is not the picture that we are trying to portray. Montgomery County has challenges, and it is a county which honestly in some ways has been, I'm going to just use this term, coasting on its positives for a number of decades. And what we're really saying is that what we need to do is not just accept the status quo and say we're going to keep coasting, being a very nice place to live, not a lot of economic development, but really, you know, a pretty community. We need to think about how we're going to take that next step and not just continue to exist, but to actually thrive. And that was why we picked that name as the title of this whole effort. That what we're looking at is not just sitting on our successes and coasting, but moving into the 21st century in a way that we're going to be able to thrive. And so when we show you some of the trends about economic issues, we aren't saying that it's a foregone conclusion that we're going down the tubes. What we're saying is that if we don't move forward, we will end up moving backwards. And that we need to, as a county, look at innovative, strong ways to move forward. And that does involve change, but it doesn't involve throwing away everything that we've been and everything that we value. It means making changes to move in new directions that are going to create the kinds of communities that the next generation, not me, not you guys, but my daughter, perhaps your grandchildren, where they're going to say, I want to live here and I can afford to live here. And that's what's going to allow us to thrive. With that, I have to hop off. That was my little,
thank you so
rah,
much.
rah, rah speech.
Thank you so much.
But
Thank you so much, Gwen.
we'll be glad to, again, follow up with anyone who has additional questions. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Gwen. Nice to see you. Carrie, do you have a question? Carrie? Laurie?
Yes, yeah, I do. It's a pretty simple one. The 200,000 additional people that are going to be coming to Montgomery County, I think that came out in 2017. I could be wrong. I would like to know, because nobody's been able to give me this, not even the HEAT staff. I would like to know, what are the projections of the development that's already been taking place, the development that's in the queue, and the development that is proposed or potentially proposed not even proposed, but predicted from the conversion of offices as a result of the pandemic. I'd like to separate that out so I know how many housing units have really very little to do with missing middle, so that I can understand missing middle a little bit more, because we've not gotten that information. That would be wonderful. And Khalid, if you wouldn't mind, I posted all those comments in the chat. If you could save the chat, which you can do in Zoom from what I understand, and respond to those to me personally in writing, I'd appreciate it so that I can share those comments and make sure it's professional, my friend.
Thank you,
All right,
Carrie.
bud.
Thank
Answer.
you, Carrie.
Will do.
Casey, can you answer this question? One of the comments that I hear in my conversation is how we are going to pay for increased development in neighborhoods, if that's roads or sewers or police or fire protection. Those are the things that we think about when we talk about adequate public facilities, and they need to be financed. But one of the trends that I've noticed for the board is that, and the county council, you've been reducing the obligation of developers and new development to pay for some of these fees. Are those two things in conflict?
Well, I think our fees are now more in line with actual cost of providing the facility. You know, I think the acid test is, how do we compare to other jurisdictions? Before the most recent revisions to our policies, which the council adopted, we had, I think, the second highest school impact fees of any jurisdiction in the greater DC region. Loudoun County is the only one that had higher rates than we do, and that's a largely greenfield community where you're just basically starting from scratch. I mean, our housing impact rates were a multiple of what most other jurisdictions in the region are. So that should tell you something about, I mean, obviously, if Arlington and Howard County and Prince George's County and Frederick County and Fairfax County can all manage to charge lower impact rates, it really raises a question like, why can't we do that? And so I think our impact tax rates are going to make us more competitive and help us get more housing built. Remember, over the long term, property tax revenue is a much bigger contributor to the tax base than impact tax rates, which are paid upfront one time when the unit is built. When it's constructed and somebody moves in and starts paying real estate taxes, that half of every property tax dollar is going to the school system. So if you're concerned about revenue for schools, you should love the idea of new apartment buildings going up in Bethesda, because they generate very few students and they throw off a lot of tax revenue that go directly to pay for schools. Now, as far as the expense of new development is concerned, I just want to point out, there's some people are saying, oh my gosh, how are you going to pay for this plan? We can't afford not to do this plan, because sprawl is what's expensive. When you have to extend roads and water and sewer lines out into new greenfield developments, that's extremely costly. Low density sprawling development, it fails to achieve economies of scale that get you efficient delivery of infrastructure. If we can do infill and redevelopment within the existing compact envelope, we can get more efficiencies because you can serve more people with the same infrastructure. Obviously, there's more wear and tear, so you have maintenance costs, but you have to maintain water and sewer pipes and roads no matter where they're built, and a lot of that deteriorates whether people are using it or not. So I think this plan actually is a huge step. If we follow through on it, it will be extremely helpful at reducing the long-term costs of public infrastructure to support growth.
I want to circle back to a comment that I think that Carrie made at the outset, and just ask for your explanation. As we noted, we did have a conversation with Patty Bubar and Adam Ortiz yesterday, talking about best practices for communities to support a climate action program. We asked about their cooperation, DEP's cooperation with the planning staff and the planning board. One of our delegates indicated that she thought that there should have been more discussion of tree canopy preservation, expansion and forest conservation in the Thrive document that she would have liked. DP officials responded that they had asked for a separate chapter on environmental protection to be included in the Thrive plan, and the planning board of planning staff did not support that idea. Can you comment on DP and the planning, the Thrive document, and whether or not there should have been more discussion of environmental protection measures?
Well, I think that it's a little silly, honestly, because we talk about environmental sustainability I haven't done a find, replace, or word count. You can check it yourself on the PDF version, but I think we mentioned environmental sustainability about 1,000 times in this document. The reason it doesn't have its own chapter is because it's an outcome. It's not a recommendation. In other words, the recommendations are supposed to drive all these outcomes. They're supposed to lead to economic competitiveness. They're supposed to lead to more equitable communities. They're supposed to lead to environmental sustainability. And every single chapter talks about how the recommendations in that chapter about compact communities and better design and better parks and recreation and transportation, more transit, et cetera, help to achieve those goals. So the idea that we've neglected it because we didn't give it a separate chapter, I think, is frankly just a misplaced criticism, because the plan pervasively discusses, and as you saw some of the slides that I showed you about stormwater, those are the kinds of ideas that figure very centrally into this document. So I don't know what DEP is talking about if they're saying we didn't include their ideas. We made it very clear that we endorse the ideas and the climate change plan, but we're trying to put the things in this plan that belong in a land use, transportation, parks plan, and leave the other things that are not related to those things that are kind of in our wheelhouse to the county's climate change plans. Those are complementary, and I don't think it would have made sense to have them try to sort of duplicate each other or overlap too much, except to the extent that they obviously should refer to each other and not be in conflict.
Thank you for responding to that concern. Nancy?
Yes, kind of in line with what you're saying about the specifics being addressed in other documents. I think it was Gwen who alluded to another document, an appendix that charted out the implementation timetable and plan and whatever. How can you furnish us with a link to that or tell us how to find that?
Yeah, I'm sure Khalid or Carrie can put a link in the chat. But the idea here was we don't want to define the specific items in the work program for the next 30 years. There needs to be some flexibility. So we have a document that's designed to last, and then we have that's more general, and then we have a document that's designed to change, which is supposed to over the next 30 years be consistent with that, but the implementation will change.
Yeah, but you yourself termed it a framework. So that's, and a work plan. I think those words were bandied about tonight.
Well, it is a framework for the work program. And just to give you an example, let's say we included in the plan the idea that there should be an additional 1,000 miles of transit ways or 500 miles of sidewalks in the county over the next 30 years. Well, what would happen if 5 years from now, it turns out we've already built 500 miles of sidewalks? Then what do we do? Or what if it turns out that 20 years from now, we haven't even got started on the sidewalks? We need to be able to adjust the work program to reflect the reality and to adapt to things while retaining the basic structure of the document so it continues to be relevant.
Well, don't you sort of want to set benchmarks? The other plans refer to ways of in general monitoring progress on things. Are you going to have a system to monitor what's being done as it's done, so everything is tracked?
The conclusion of every single chapter is a set of benchmarks. I'm glad you asked. It has metrics. So but those metrics are framed in terms of which direction are we trying to go. So for example, how will we know we're making progress on transportation and the environment? Well, one thing will be if we're reducing vehicle miles traveled per household. if we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions attributable to transportation in the county, if we're increasing the amount of physical activity that people get from walking and bicycling. These are all metrics which can be measured and can be clearly evaluated. And we can say, well, we were at X level in 2021 when this plan was adopted, and now that it's 2031, we can compare and see how we're doing. But the point is that trying to specify exactly what the project is that needs to be done to correct for deficiencies or catch up or slow down or whatever.
I'm confused because, as you know, I serve on the Transportation Planning Board, and those mobility studies are only done, every 10 years or whatever. So how are you going to know if I'm walking more or driving less?
Well, as you probably know from working with TPB, there's a lot of new technology that's available. Like there's a firm called Streetlight that we have a contract with that measures mobility. So they can tell you how many more people are walking or biking or driving in a given location. And they can give that information to you, not totally in real time, but pretty close to it. You don't need to rely on some of the travel surveys that TPB has done in the past. There's more data collection methods. And that's another reason, by the way, why we shouldn't write that kind of thing into the plan, because things change technologically. And
are you saying like tracking cell phones and stuff?
Yeah, that's one thing that Streetlight does. There's other ways to do it. For example, in the park,
not everybody allows for their location to be identified.
It doesn't matter because Streetlight can detect the signal even if they're not identifying you personally. They can tell that the cell phone has pinged a server or an antenna, and they can measure your presence even if they don't know who you are. So there's a lot of new technology, and that's one of the reasons why we don't want to be too specific, because that evolves every single year, and there may be other ways of measuring those sort of things 5 years from now or 10 years from now, and we are not going to lock ourselves into saying,
okay, just let us know when you're following us around.
Yeah, well, nobody's following you, but there's no way to avoid the fact that there is data out there which you make public just by the fact that you're walking around with a cell phone in your pocket. That doesn't mean they can identify you, Nancy, and say, this is the person that's associated with that cell phone ping, but they know that there was a signal that was sent from somebody's device that touched the tower, and they can collect that information in the aggregate and figure out how many people are moving around.
Okay, well, please provide us the link to that appendix that maybe pertains to this so we can get a better understanding of how that's going to work. Thank you.
I've just put the link in the chat to the.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
So let's, Casey and staff have been very generous with their time. It's 9:48. Let's have a hard close at 10 o'clock. I know that Karen has a question.
Yeah, or again, a bit of a comment, just going back again to the whole housing piece and everything. I think, in terms of these ideas about this, I think, we've been talking about compatibility a lot. Maybe another way to put this is predictability. I think one of the things that people are concerned about is not having a real sense of what's going to happen with these development units. When you had, a townhouse development or a site plan and all those kind of things that Carrie was talking and people have been talking about, those were a way you could see, okay, for this particular development, it's planned for here, it's going to have this kind of structure, it's going to be this big, so forth. We can all get a sense as to what's going to happen and whether we can live with it or not. I think one of the things about these ZTAs, and I was glad to hear Gwen saying to slow down, was that they were structuring it to be a by right sort of process. And I understand why they want to do that, in the sense of if you're doing a single house at a time, a site plan is obviously overkill, but it still leaves very much open for people's concerns and questions about what is it that you're being allowed to do by right. So I think one of the things I'm going to suggest very strongly in the last meeting, the heat and everything else, is that whatever gets proposed here, whatever gets approved, to the extent that things are being done by right, I think it's going to have some more constraints, some more predictability, some more statements. Maybe it's the form plans, maybe it's these are the models that are allowed, this kind of thing, just so that people have a sense, okay, we'll do this up front, we'll do this one time in terms of figuring out what's allowed and what's acceptable. And then each person who goes to build one of these houses doesn't have to do it over again, but at least at some point we have the real community involvement, real hands-on nitty-gritty kind of discussion whether it's for a community as a whole or for certain plan designs or whatever. But I think that's a concept I'd really hope you all can incorporate into your comments that eventually going to be going to the council. That I think that's what people would feel. You get a lot more comfort level, I think, with people if they had a sense that they knew what might be happening in their neighborhood.
I agree wholeheartedly. And that's why chapter 3 design, remember I showed you those pictures of the diagram of the sidewalk and the building and how they relate to each other. That's the whole point of that, is that we're trying to replace vague concepts like quote unquote compatibility with compatibility standards that are more specific and certain. So that protects both people who are concerned about what's going to be built next to them, and it also protects property owners that want to build something because they know in advance what's allowed and what's not allowed. So I think that you're absolutely right on point.
2 more questions, Jerry Garson.
Will the climate changes occurring by 2050 result in a significant part of the District of Columbia south of Pennsylvania Avenue in downtown have flooding at high tides every day? We see that the Navy Yard is proposed building a 14-foot flood wall around its property. We see Alexandria and the tidal basin flooding every day at high tide. The water is going up as the ice is melting in Greenland and the Antarctic. Are we planning for this?
Yes. The good news is we're about a little over 300 feet above sea level, so we won't probably be underwater, but we assume that there's going to be more violent weather events in the short term, more flooding, and that's a big part of the reason we're arguing not just for reducing our own contribution to greenhouse gas emissions for things like driving or inefficient buildings, but also talking about things like better stormwater management, because that's important to be able to adapt to climate change and make sure that the property that's here and human beings that are in the way are not hurt when there's increased effects of climate change locally.
I understand that the entire county and the entire state of Maryland and most of the US is built for the 10-year rain. We're now getting the 100-year rain every year. Will we expand all our stormwater pipes to even account for all of this?
Well, I think that, as I said, like you saw the diagram with Pike and Rose, it reduces runoff like by 77% from a 2-year storm. For a more extreme storm, it doesn't capture all the water. It doesn't even capture 100% of the water for a 2-year storm. But if you cumulatively have more properties that have more stormwater infiltration, you can mitigate the effects of that, even if you do have intermittent events that overwhelm the stormwater measures that exist on any particular property. So do we need stronger stormwater standards? I would argue that would be tough. Maybe that's the direction we need to go. But this plan certainly recognizes the fact that that is an issue. And that's one of the reasons why we think it's important to have the kind of redevelopment that will support those better stormwater management technologies than were in place when the property was developed originally decades ago.
Carrie Lamari.
Okay, I have to say this. I wasn't going to, but I have a different take than Karen on the missing middle, the compact communities, whatever you want to call it. We're looking at a 50-year plan. There is no one-size-fits-all solution to each and every development. Every project should be decided on its own merits. That's why I believe in master plans and public participation. We should never lock the public out. Okay, by doing it by right, by having these what do you call them, form-based subdivisions, we are locking the public out. What occurs in one community or neighborhood may not occur in another community, or we may have a catastrophic situation or a situation that's a real problem for one community that needs attention. When you have it form-based, when you have it by right, the community is locked out. That development's going to go forward because it's up to that property owner. We did it with TDRs. We required subdivision process. We required site plan review. I think that's really important because what happens along Georgia Avenue in Montgomery Hills is totally different than what might happen on Wisconsin Avenue or on Connecticut Avenue or even on George Avenue towards Albany. You know, when we talk about location, there's a whole realm of things that go into that location. Elevation of properties, stormwater management, things that require that impact visibility for certain households. Please do not close the community out of the discussion. Require site plan at a minimum and allow the public the opportunity to object. Okay, that's all I'm going to say.
And let me,
I just want to point out that this is, you're answering Nancy's argument, because that's why this plan does not displace the local, neighborhood by neighborhood master planning process. You can have different standards, different neighborhoods. The point is that we shouldn't be like relitigating everything from first principles every time somebody wants to build a duplex. That's the issue.
Casey, I have a final question for you. What kind of changes do you expect that the county council would make with your draft after it has its hearings and has its work sessions? What kind of things might change over that process?
This guy is good, but
Well, I hope nothing. I think this plan is great. I think they'll love it too. I think that the focus of discussion will probably be on a couple of these issues talked about tonight. Everybody is very focused on missing middle lately, and that's fine. Although in some ways it kind of disappoints me, to be honest with you, because I think the fact that Will Juando and Hans and others have, proposed missing middle right now has got everybody very fixated on that particular subject. And there's like 100 ideas in this plan. So but the plan is not that long. I think it's 6 chapters. No one of these chapters is more than about 2,500 words. So really you could read the thing in, a couple hours without really pushing it too much. If you really wanted to do that, I'd just encourage you. I think you're going to find a lot of things in there that are really interesting. Some of it you'll probably disagree with, but I think you're going to find there's a lot of good ideas in here that you can get behind. And I sort of wish everybody would maybe step back a minute from the obsession with this argument of good or bad about missing middle, and realize this is a big plan for a long time, and really it's about more than just whether or not you can build a duplex. That's just one small part of it.
Well, I think I speak for a lot of us that we really appreciate the hard work and professionalism and expertise of the planning department staff, the park staff. I think we're very well served. I sort of agree that there's been a lot of emphasis on the missing middle piece, and that the other parts of the plan are incredibly important. So thank you so much. And please extend our appreciation to the staff for all of their hard work. Are there any questions before we conclude for the evening? Then seeing none, thank you.
Alan, can they post the slides?
Sure.
Yeah, we will post the slides. So
thank you so much for inviting us. We appreciate it, and we're always available to the Civic Federation and any of your member organizations as well.
Well, thank you, Khalid, for reaching out to us.
Thank you. Thank you for the time. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. And we'll post this video within the next 24 hours.
Alan, can you somehow post the chat in the video?
I will send you the chat.
No, I want you to post it on YouTube.
There's lots of things in the chat, and we're not going to post the chat. I will send you the.
Well, the chat's a good portion of the discussion. I think it would help. But
okay, I'll take that under advisement, Carrie. Thank you for your participation, and thank you everybody else. And stay tuned for the next program. Good night.